Perfect. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. It's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome you here at the Geneva Graduate Institute, both in person in this auditorium as well as online. I know from our perspective here we cannot see it, but there are a lot of people who are joining us online as well. Today we're going to have a very important conversation about climate overshoot and specifically how to reduce the risks associated with it. My name is Anne Saab. I'm an associate professor of international law and a faculty associate with the Center for International Environmental Studies here at the Institute, and I'm going to be moderating today's conversation. In 2015, the 195 states parties to the Paris Agreement agreed on the central objective to keep the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and went even further in their efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This 1.5 degree objective is informed by scientific risk assessments, and it is a limit beyond which the risks of extreme and irreversible climate change effects may no longer be avoided. Despite these very clear and urgent objectives, the World Meteorological Organization has estimated that 2023 on average was already almost 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. What solutions are there when emissions reduction strategies are not being met, or at least not at the necessary pace? How do we remove large stocks of carbon dioxide that will remain in the atmosphere even if and when we are successful in reducing emissions? How do we promote vital adaptation strategies that will be necessary, regardless of any success in mitigation? And what of the technologies that are sometimes promoted as alternatives to reducing emissions? Who should foot the bill for all of this? And how should responsibilities be distributed? The Climate Overshoot Commission, through their CARE agenda, and I hope that I'm pronouncing it correctly, I assume that we say CARE agenda, have presented a strategy for addressing these complex and interconnected questions, focusing on dealing with the risks of what is called climate overshoot, basically going beyond the 1.5 degree target. Their report was published in September 2023. It is an honor to be sharing the stage today with Right Honourable Kim Campbell, former Prime Minister of Canada and Canada's first and so far only Prime Minister, a female Prime Minister, and a member of the Climate Overshoot Commission, and Mr. Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization and Chair of the Climate Overshoot Commission. Welcome. And what we're going to do today, I will be posing a few questions to Ms. Campbell and Mr. Lamy regarding specifically about their work on the Climate Overshoot Commission and particularly on the report that they have published. And then we will have time for Q&A from the audience as well. And maybe I should have said this event is being recorded, so just so that you know that. All right, so let me get started. With the first question to Pascal Lamy. Could you please tell us what the main idea is behind the Climate Overshoot Commission? Why was it created? What are its main objectives? And what does the CARE agenda stand for?
Thanks, and thanks to the HEI for organizing this interactive session. Good to be back here. The Climate Overshoot Commission was a creation of the Paris Peace Forum. And the Paris Peace Forum is a sort of new, big international gathering, the purpose of which is to explore the frontiers of global governance and the gaps of global governance in order to try and address the broader problems and the gaps that we all know we have in a multi-stakeholder way. So it's not without diplomats, and we love diplomats, but it's about mobilizing mostly other than diplomats in order to try and get a few things done in this international system, which, as we all know, has a hard time doing anything nowadays. So the Paris Peace Forum created this commission the mandate of which was to re-look at this 1.5 issue, whether we had any chance of getting there, and in a way which was new, i.e., please consider together all the available options, including options which remain very controversial, like geoengineering. So you look at the whole range of ways to address climate change, do it independently. So you take a bunch of people who are depending on no authority. You ask them to come with bold ideas, not repeating what we know. And you do that in a way which is more representative of the stakeholders than usual. Meaning, I was asked to chair this commission as the former chair of the Paris Peace Forum, which I chaired during the 5 first years of its existence, from 2019 on. I composed a commission with representatives from the 5 continents, which was the first time ever in a global body looking at climate change, with a majority of people coming from the South, which was the first time ever in such a body that we had 7 people from the South, 5 from the North, 5 continents, a variety of experiences, people like him, who had been both in government and activists in a number of areas after that, people like me, leaders of international organizations, heads of state and government, or former heads of state and government, and gender parity, which was the first time in a body of that kind that we had this sort of representativity. Now, not that we were given any legitimacy by anybody. We are not representing anybody than ourselves collectively. That's the price of independence and the benefits of interdependence. So we spent roughly 18 months, a bit more than that, nearly 2 years, in re-exploring the issue. We came to the conclusion after many, many hearings and internal deliberations that there was still a tiny chance of avoiding hitting the 1.5 threshold, but that given where we are, the risk of getting there was increasing every day. So our starting point is the risk of overshooting 1.5 is higher today than yesterday, and was higher yesterday than the day before yesterday. Hence, the necessity to reassess the options in a way which will help addressing this risk. So, sort of newness constraint in relooking at cutting emissions, adaptation, well-known strategies, removing carbon, less well-known, but now clearly in the picture. Not least because if you start emitting, what's up there will remain there for centuries, so you need to reduce it in order to cool the planet. And geoengineering, which is, as we all know, a much more controversial option, under one version, which is the one that has been the most scientifically assessed and explored, which is solar radiation modification. We came after all this work, and we had a very solid science-based secretariat, and most of our deliberations were based on science. Of course, we had lots of hearings with politicians and with stakeholders, and we came to this clear agenda, and this is my final bit of answer to your question. C-A-R-E. C for cutting emissions, A for adaptation, R for removal of carbon, and E for exploring solar radiation modification. And we came to this C-A-R-E, care, in order to make clear, and this is the collective consensus among these 12 people, that C comes before A, comes before R, comes before E. So there is an implicit/explicit order of priorities in order to address the various objections that some have that adaptation is the way to go because anyhow we won't cut emissions in time. Address the objections of those who say, no, look, we will never get there. Geoengineering is the way to go. Stop doing things which do not work. We have something that might work much better and it's much cheaper. So we wanted to address all these debates, and there are legitimate debates, and to propose a holistic approach. And the best compliment I got on the report, which we published mid-September, was in Dubai, when I had a very serious meeting with a major US active environmental organization, which said, reading the report gives us what a serious agenda of addressing climate change would be about. And I think there's a bit of truth in that it's the first time that the issue is looked at comprehensively, including in paving the way for a discussion on trade-offs. And that's one of the big problems we have in addressing climate change, that the discussion is clustered. And in our view, you have to open the whole scope and then start discussing with trade-offs, not that we could provide a utility function of these trade-offs with X of cuts and Y of adaptation and Z. We cannot do that. It can be done at global level, it can be done at local level, and there may be different trade-offs at global level and local level. So that's our main message. And of course, the purpose is clearly about energizing the discussion, and we will, I'm sure, come back on a number of our proposals. They've been made public, they've already triggered quite a lot of debate, and not just in the West, also in Africa, in the Pacific, and that's where we believe we can produce more thoughts, more debate, and more awareness of possible trade-offs.
Thank you very much. And my following question is for Kim Campbell. In the report by the Climate Overshoot Commission, the different sections, they all contain a part on broadly governance challenges. Could you please share with us what some of the main challenges of global climate governance are and what your recommendations are in dealing with these challenges?
Well, perhaps we'll spend a whole weekend talking about that. And like Professor Saab, I'm also a lawyer. When I was at law school and people talk about international law, they would always say that's an oxymoron. And one might say the same about global governance. But I think it is fair to say that, particularly when we're in Geneva with some very important organizations, that what often starts as the global convening of states to discuss issues can sometimes evolve into, in fact, treaties and agreements and commitments to follow certain kinds of policies, and you have to start somewhere. And I think that when we talked, we were meeting earlier today with people from the WHO, and Pascal was commenting that the Paris Agreement was actually a major step forward, but with a cost. The cost was that the countries set their own goals for implementation. So the governance with respect to dealing with climate change is to use a technical term, kind of higgledy-piggledy. It is, based on some agreements and treaties, as the Paris Agreement was, but other areas where there is, better sort of intentions and actually deliverability, and that the weakness of the Paris Agreement is very clear. But there are many ways, I think, where we have globally created workable institutions of governance. When we think of things like the Montreal Protocol, when we think of things like acid rain treaties, we think there's a lot of ways in which we've addressed environmental issues with agreements where countries have actually agreed to adhere to certain kind of conventions and be held accountable for them. So I think when we are looking at things like SRM, for example, one of the things that we state most clearly is that there has to be some kind of governance structure. Who will make the decisions? Who will evaluate the science? What will the criteria be? And one of the reasons we included this, and incidentally, the letters of our acronym are in order of declining order of importance. So C, the cutting missions, is the most important, then adaptation. So the E is not the most important, but it is an important priority, because before we can even decide, what we're concerned about is, what if we get into a situation where there are just desperate threats to human life, where there is desperate human suffering, and someone says, as Pascal says, we have this cheap, wonderful device, we can lower temperature. If we do not have the research, if we do not have an agreed upon mechanism for evaluating and establishing thresholds where we might or might not act using these things, then people will either act unilaterally, countries may act unilaterally, or we may do things that we are later sorry for. And one of the things we talked about today with WHO is how important healthcare issues are in any set of criteria. So when we're creating governance structures, we have to make sure we've got the right people at the table asking the right questions, so that we come up with that. It might be that if we have the right kind of body to engage, and it could, the World Meteorological Association could be a very important partner there, World Health Organization, we could create some kind of structure. Then we can make wise decisions, but most importantly, we can ensure that countries that are affected are part of those decisions. In other words, we have a lot to do, but we are not without effective bodies that have pieces of the expertise that can come together. And the most important thing, as Pascal said, our approach was meant to be holistic and to try to draw together different facets of knowledge, expertise, and understanding to try to answer some questions. The other thing I would say about global governance is that governance isn't just government-to-government relationships. When we have democracies in particular, and some of the international agreements we create the rule of law, and we often create usable mechanisms for holding people accountable. And I live in Italy now, and I've gotten to know some people in Italy who are very interested in this whole question of holding fossil fuel companies accountable, for example, under existing statutes, either domestically or internationally. And we've seen in the United States school children who have sued the government of Montana for not protecting the environment. There are all sorts of interesting ways that people use the rule of law to hold people accountable who may not be held accountable by governments who have not yet got the political constituency to act. And how do you create the political constituency for wise policy? That's often a difficult challenge. So when we talk about global governments, we're talking about the capacity to create political will based on people's understanding of the stakes. And that's not always easy, because those who would like to push back against action in global warming have a lot of money and a lot of power, and not a lot of often moral restraints about using their power. So global governance requires us to look at all of the different mechanisms that we have to use fair and to develop legal instruments, whether they be global agreements, global organizations, partnerships between global organizations, or the individual capacities that certain states have to hold people accountable. And by creating this sense that there is, that we can be empowered, because I think there are many difficult questions, but I'm much encouraged. And again, talking this morning with people at WHO and the health agreements, the health conversations that they had in Dubai, that they actually were able to get governments to sign on to certain agreements about having healthcare as a very important part of the conversation about climate change. So on the one hand, it's impossible. On the other hand, it's not impossible, but it happens in fits and starts. But again, as people become more concerned about the effects of global warming, the political will to create that kind of collaboration will, I think, grow. But, Churchill was right when he said that democracy was the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. And we know that in global terms, trying to create workable, conventions and agreements and treaties can be very, very difficult. And sometimes we need to frame the scope of these agreements in ways that allow a certain flexibility or a certain thresholds of activity. So that's where our legal scholars can be so important in helping us to look at the templates that exist and possible templates to make global governance in these key issues possible, to provide ways for states to collaborate and be held accountable for the commitments that they make. So that's a long answer to a short question and not a satisfactory one, but I guess I would say that I'm not pessimistic about the ability to create these structures. I think we have shown the ability to do it, but I'm also not optimistic about the ability to do it without a lot of pushback from some parties in some countries.
Thank you very much. I know it's going to be very difficult to get everything out in just 1 hour, but thank you so much. I thought that was a fantastic response, very clear. I wanted to ask Pascal Lamy now about solar radiation modification. So this is something that Campbell mentioned as part of the E, exploring. So it is sort of at the end of the priority, but there is a lot of debate about solar radiation modification. And I would like to ask you, what are the particular risks and benefits? What do we know about solar radiation modification, about the risks and the benefits? And can you tell us a little bit about let's say, the state of the debate?
Yeah, and let me repeat that even if this is the area which has attracted the most public attention, and understandably, because this is the newest one, and news go to news, it's not the only proposal that we are making, and we might come back to others. Now, solar radiation modification is a potential technology to not address the origins of climate change, which is carbon dioxide emissions and the stock which is there and which creates the greenhouse effect, but the consequences of that in limiting the heating that comes from the greenhouse effect, in emulating, basically, and I'm not going to be too complex, what happens with volcano eruptions. When a major volcano eruption takes place, lots of particles get in the air, and observations show that this has led to a reduction of temperature, because each of these particles acts, and again, let me put it extremely simply, as a very small mirror that reflects solar radiation. So the idea is to consider a technology which would be sending flying objects up there, which would spread particles in a way and with quantities and nature of these particles that would act as a big mirror that would send back solar radiation, hence avoiding global heating. And there are quite a number of theoretical approaches that have been studied, mostly by climate specialists and specialists of physics, that show, in theory, that doing this might be doable. But these studies, are very much on the beginning of the learning curve, and second, also show that there may be counter effects. Because there is no guarantee at this stage that the distribution of this heat decrease of the cooling would be fair. And it needs to be fair, because if you cool a part of the planet and you keep heating another one, or you increase the heating in another one, then you got into a bigger problem. Second, that there are risks of, for instance, what is called the termination shock. Let's assume we do that, it works, and then suddenly it does not work. And then you are back with a very rapid increase of temperature, whether what you've been trying to do is to address slowly a decrease of the temperature. So it's risky, and there is a lot of unknown. And what we have, after, again, lots and lots of consideration, and I'm not going to reveal any secret of the deliberations of the Commission, because otherwise people don't speak their mind and we don't move forward. But on an issue like this, there is a clear difference of mindset, depending on your attitude. A number of countries which are very sensitive to climate change, and we've already seen that in a number of them, are more ready than others to look at risky options, not least because the vision they have of what the risk is and what is the possible trade-off between risk is different. Now, SRM, as a number of other geoengineering technologies, are risky, certainly. So our conclusion was that we had to keep investing in science of these technologies, and this is not a big financial issue. It's a question of a few billion compared to the trillions you need for adaptation. It's a drop in the sea. But also, we recommend a moratorium on experiments which would go beyond the lab door, and that would risk having, even as experiment, negative effects. So that's the balance which we have found. Hence, this option that we suggest of establishing a moratorium on, let's say, large-scale and risky experiments. But we do not propose, after consideration of many options, we do not propose an international conference to negotiate this moratorium, because our experience, and some of us are old monkeys in the international system, our experience is that if you say we need an international conference that will establish the terms of the moratorium, will be there 30 years from now. So what we propose is that sovereigns, countries, unilaterally declare that they will apply such a moratorium. Now, we've provided for a sort of minimal requirement of the user's notice. By the way, we are ready to work more on that. If country X says, well, I'm interested by your idea, but, can you be a bit more precise? Can you draft my government declaration, for instance, considering blah, blah, blah? This is what we decide to do in these conditions. And our view is that on this planet among the sort of 200 usual suspects. Some of them might want to step in. And that if they do that, the others will have to answer the question of why don't you step in? And that this might create a dynamic that will help a deepening the understanding of this question, and there clearly is a need for much more research, but also in a way that addresses the risks. And again, and this is back to the care agenda, we do not believe that there is a silver bullet solution. We believe that the solution can only come of a proper combination of existing approaches while accepting that these various options can and should be re-weighted together. And this is an intensely political debate, which is why the proposal we've made, for instance, on cutting emission, we propose to stop fossil fuel, which is not rocket science, although, by the way, you've seen in Dubai that doing this will generate a series of discussions, but we propose to do it in a different way for North and South. So we've taken the political option to say you cannot ask poor countries to stop using fossil fuels the way. So you have to combine cutting with common and differentiated responsibility. And if you're serious about doing this, you need to leave adaptation, phasing, exiting for developing countries. And this necessitates much more precision, not least because at the end of the day, if you do that, you need northern countries to be not carbon neutral in 2050. You need them to be carbon positive in order to leave the necessary room for what developing countries will emit in the meantime. Now, it's very often per head a much lower level than what US or China, or not to speak about others, do. But you have to enter into a level of precision, which is what we did about this SRM moratorium, in order to credibilize more these various options.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to build on some of the things that you mentioned here in your answers. So you spoke about fairness, you spoke about different mindset depending on where, which countries and what kinds of risks that they're facing. So my next question to Kim Campbell is in a way a much bigger, well, not that this wasn't a big question that I posed before, but a much bigger question about one of the major obstacles in climate change negotiations has always been and still is differentiation. So basically the North-South divide, if you want to put it a bit simplistically. How does the Climate Overshoot Commission contribute to resolving these difficult questions and often seemingly irreconcilable positions?
Well, you know, it's another example. We were representative of countries from the North and South, including our president of the island country of Kiribati, which is, you know, just hanging in there with the waves, folks. So we had, I think, a very representative set of realities that we live. And there are two aspects of this. One is the impact of climate change and its differentiated impact north and south, because often there's the countries of the global south that are having some of the worst impacts in terms of, and even though, I mean, is Pakistan in the south, but the countries that we think of as being the less well-to-do countries are often the ones that are being grievously affected by climate change. And then there is the moral issue that the countries of the global north are the ones who have contributed the vast amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So you have countries that are having a disproportionate high impact from climate change with a disproportionately low responsibility for creating it. So there is a recipe for disaster. But I think what is interesting, again, as I said, that you know, one can be very pessimistic, but when in the COP was it 27, in Sharm el Sheikh, I always skip which number is which. Finally, the concept of loss and damage was accepted, and this was a big deal to get some of the wealthier countries of the world willing to commit to provide resources to compensate the countries of the global south who have been disproportionately affected by climate change, to compensate them and to help them adapt to the negative effects that climate change is having on their countries. Now, is it enough? Probably no. And you can see interesting discussions, particularly after the latest COP, that countries have committed to giving funds, but the funds are not forthcoming. And this is, I don't, it may annoy me, but I don't despair, because I remember at a time when loss and damage was not going to be talked about. In the same way, I remember a time when people didn't even want to talk about adaptation, because they thought if we talk about adaptation, then that will take our minds off cutting greenhouse gases. In the same way, when we wanted to talk about overshoot, people said, well, don't talk about overshoot because we should be focusing on getting to the 1.5 limit. So I think the Commission was extremely conscious of both the moral and the, how we call it, the geographical or climate impact divides between North and South. We were very conscious of having the voices, and not just as members of our commission, but with the people that we consulted and where we met, because we met in Nairobi and Indonesia. We met in places in Egypt, places where we were talking firsthand to people who were experiencing this phenomenon in a different way from the way they're experiencing it. Although, I think we do point this out, this notion of a north-south divide between the impacts of climate change is becoming less and less tenable. If we look at things like, I'm from Vancouver, and the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest. My husband is in California as we speak, and the atmospheric rivers, as a result of climate change, that are inundating California, Southern California, where they're getting a year's rain in one day, 24-hour period, this kind of thing. I think the ability of some parts of the world to think that they are going to be able to endure these effects more successfully is becoming less and less, which may, in fact, help to raise the level of awareness of their populations. Whether it will make them more generous towards the countries of the global south is another issue if they're facing dramatic costs of their own. But I think, as I say, I would point to the loss and damage breakthrough in COP. Was that 27 or 28? What did we just have? 29?
No.
Yeah, 28, I guess, in Sharm el Sheikh. I think that is a sign that we can make progress. And certainly when we talk about, for example, in the cutting emissions, we have said this unambiguously requires the phasing out of fossil fuels. But we have said, as Pascal mentioned, that this is a requirement that the countries of the global north and the rich industrial countries must do much more quickly. To allow, now it may be that the countries of the global south could leapfrog over some fossil fuel technologies, although doing that requires a lot of investment and a lot of infrastructure in creating, the idea we may want to do it, but we may physically not be able to do it as fast as we would like. But to give them more room to maneuver, and it would be great if they could leapfrog some of the fossil fuel dependency, not simply for purposes of climate change, but also for purposes of pollution and their own well-being and healthy environments. But we clearly recognize that because of this moral obligation of the high polluting and high emitting countries, that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all for the phasing out of fossil fuels. There has to be a willingness to allow the countries that have been disproportionately negatively affected by the emissions of the wealthy countries to make the changes in ways that do not impoverish them or make the problems that we're dealing with even worse. So I would say that the north-south tensions and the differentiation was a very important part of the mindset and the terms of reference that we brought to our deliberations, enhanced by our ability to meet in different places and to have the voices of many different parts of the world around the table as we were discussing.
Thank you very much. So let me again build on some of the points that came out here. The answer, another question to Pascal Lamy, a big question about money. So all of this climate action, whether we're talking about mitigation or adaptation or loss and damage or research, for new technologies. All of this is expensive. So what recommendations does the Climate Overshoot Commission have in terms of addressing the enormous gap of what is needed, between what is needed and what is available for climate finance?
Well, we have devoted a final chapter to the finance issue, the resourcing issue, although we did not spend a lot of time on this because it's in itself a huge topic. And as you know, there are a series of attempts in various quarters, including the summit which the French president gathered last June on this. So, and I'll be very schematic. There are two basic avenues. The first one is sort of business as usual with more. So, North-South development money, partnerships, taxes on shipping, on whatever, that would bring new resources, that would be devoted to financing this huge gap, which is terrible in a way. When you look at the numbers, we are nowhere near any reasonable chance of getting to the levels which adaptation first, cutting emission seconds, although this is much less costly than adaptation, or carbon removal, where again there is no real economic model. So that's the first, and I'm sure a few things can be done. Then there is the other avenue, which we did not really explore, we mentioned, and with which I'm trying to put together a few people with a few ideas, which is redefining the whole problem. And redefining the whole problem, in my view, is answering one question, which is how can you get global market capitalism to properly price nature? Now, it's a huge question, but I think this is the real question. As long as we do not provide even a partial answer to this question, we won't get there. That's my personal view. Again, it's not something that the Commission has considered and properly deliberated. To put it, again, very simply, we know a bit of what pricing emissions can do. A bit. And we Europeans have invented this emission trading system, which has created a market, but it's the regulation that has created the market, and the market didn't appear from whatever great idea coming from the sky. So we start having a notion of how we can price these negative externalities in pricing emissions. But for instance, we do not know how to incentivize carbon storage. So we can start pricing carbon emissions, but there's nothing like a serious at scale. Now, we have experiments. There was a very interesting deal that was spearheaded by the Inter-American Development Bank on the debt for nature swap in Galapagos and Barbados. This is very interesting because at some stage, if it's about a debt for nature swap, you have to give a price. How much debt do you relieve for the price of the conservation commitment? So then you have to give a price. You're obliged to give a price. But this is a tiny little thing. So to answer your question, I'm convinced personally that we really have to get much more serious about transforming the way we measure resources. And for instance, this notion, and I have lots of African friends now who believe that, the future of Africa is bright. There is a treasure of carbon in Africa, which we will succeed in monetizing. So we don't need any more money for other things. We just have to monetize. But doing this implies carbon markets that work. And there's nothing like serious carbon markets other than the ones that have been regulated. So this whole issue, in my view, is still very much ahead of us. We needed a finance chapter because this is about getting serious. But for the moment, we've not looked at the whole issue enough. And that, by the way, was not within our mandate, nor was it in the limited resources, which a number of philanthropic organizations, mostly American, I must say, gave us to fund our commission back office and meetings.
Thank you very much. Actually, the part of this response reminded me of what Mrs. Campbell said before in response to the question about governance. You said it's about getting the right people at the table to ask the right questions, and I think precisely the sort of redefining what the problem is or questioning what the problem is. I think those are particularly important points, especially for where we are here in an educational setting, where I think it's really important not just to say we're going to find solutions, but also to question what actually is the problem that we are addressing and whose perspective of that problem are we considering. Thank you very much. I have one final question for Kim Campbell, which is trying to kind of get back to where we started in this conversation. So the question is there still time, or is it too late already to meet the 1.5 degree goal? And how does the work of the Climate Overshoot Commission set you apart from other initiatives in engaging with this question as well?
Well, I think there's evidence that we certainly have exceeded the 1.5 for certain periods of time in certain parts of the world. But the point is that whether it's too late to do it without an overshoot of some kind, we still need to look at the problems created by an overshoot and to figure out how we can try and get back. And again, when we're talking about removal of carbon dioxide, we're talking about going down from the 1.5. We're trying to get to a level of greenhouse gases that will actually cool the earth. So I think there's no option. We try to talk up. I mean, in theory, we could still do it. It would require perhaps a certain amount of remarkable activity. But I think the point is, whether we do or we don't, the concept of what an overshoot means is something that needs to be understood. And I would also just say that looking at this, there are so many things that are happening, and adding on to what Pascal was talking about, the money. When we talk about the money, it isn't just money coming from governments and international organizations to fund adaptation, etc. Money works in a lot of different ways through the market. And one of the things that I've always thought, I've always said that it's going to come down to money, is the insurance industry. Here we are in one of the country, which is one of the headquarters of the insurance industry. And the insurance industry is the lubricant that enables modern business to take place. If we can't insure our risks, we can't take risks, and we aren't going to go to things. And more insurance companies are refusing to take risks that climate change tells them are big losers. So the money is working that way. There is simply not going to be underwriting of activities that simply cannot succeed, or more importantly, perhaps where people are going to be held liable. Why would you insure companies who are doing things that, in fact, they may be found liable under legal requirements for their negative environmental impacts? And now that we have the increasing development of attribution science, where we can say much more clearly how much of certain kinds of disasters is attributable to climate change. When we're talking about accountability and liability, as more and more information comes out, us lawyers have the concept of mens rea, when we know that oil companies have known for decades and deliberately obfuscated the science. So we have legal concepts that allow us to use these to hold companies accountable. And again, the markets are responding, that people are not going to invest in companies that are running those risks and that have that kind of moral hazard. So there are ways that the money works that isn't just through transfers of capital based on loss and damage agreements. Those are very important. But there are other ways in which the flow of resources to negative environmental impacts are going to be impacted as people have greater knowledge and as more and more people recognize that they're being impacted. So the bad news is we're feeling, the effects of climate change in very frightening ways. The good news is we're feeling the effects of climate change in frightening ways because it wakes a lot of people up to realize that it's not something far away, it could be for them. And that will have financial impact. So I think what we have to do is we have to say, here's what we committed to. And when we don't meet that goal, here are the negative things that are happening. And here is an analysis of ways in which we can address those issues. As Pascal's colleague said, I think he called it kind of the North Star of a framework for what a climate negotiation should be. And I don't think any of us, thinks that, our commission that, we are going to, change the world. We all try to be a tile in the mosaic of progress. But clear thinking is really important. And we agreed in the world to 1.5. And if we are going to overshoot it, and I remember when Pascal called me and said, would you like to be part of a commission on climate overshoot? And I said, what is climate overshoot and why does it need a commission? I certainly know the answer to those questions now. But it does matter. And I think, so I don't think it's too late. I would be sad if the overshoot continues to grow. But as long as we see it as an overshoot, and our commission's report says this is something that calls out for us to have even greater devotion to the work that we need to do, greater clarity on the priorities, and response to the needs for governance and control that can help us make wise decisions as crises get worse, then I think that's important. So I hope it's not too late in the sense that I seriously suspect we are overshooting, but I hope that it might be, not a forever overshoot. But I think that there is no alternative to thinking seriously about this. There is no alternative to taking a hard-nosed view of what it's going to take to address climate change. And we need to do it. And we need to do it for ourselves and for our future generations. And I would just conclude by saying that in our discussions, we had a wonderful youth engagement group that posed a lot of uncomfortable questions and had a lot of very in-depth knowledge. And the sense of intergenerational justice was another, in the sense of the moral framework, north-south justice, but intergenerational justice was really important. So we have to keep looking at it. We can't just throw our hands up.
One small compliment on the youth group, which was an innovation. We decided to have a youth group participating not as commissioners. They didn't have to agree to the conclusion. They participated. It's a fantastic experience. But I can tell you, it's not an easy experience. Because, and by the way, we started with 12 of them from various continents, which we had very carefully, randomly, but proportionally selected. And at the end of the day, I think we ended with 6 or 7 of them. 5 of them dropped because we had too many conflicts and they were too unhappy about what we were doing or the way we were doing. But I would recommend other bodies of this kind to have a youth group as a sort of sparring partner. Again, they did not have to agree, but the interaction we had with them seriously reverberated into interactions within the Commission. A number of times where one of you said, hey, that's my point, but the youth group said it, so I agree with them. Or others saying, what they said is a real pie in the sky. No way we can go. So it had a very substantive impact at the end of the day, even if the interaction was sometimes bumpy. I would recommend disseminating this innovation.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sure you can find plenty of people who would be interested in-house to contribute to this commission and to other initiatives. So we have a few minutes remaining, and I would like to open up for questions from the audience. I suggest, if that's all right with both of you, that we collect 3 questions. So we do a round. If I could please ask you, Isabel has the microphone. She'll come and give the microphone to you. If I could ask you to please briefly introduce yourself so that we know who's asking the question. And if I could also ask, I know I haven't done it, but I'm sitting here, to keep your questions brief.
We have 4 questions.
Yes. Well, 5, yeah.
Okay, fine. Let's
Can
have
we do
5.
5 altogether? Okay, we'll do those 5 and then we'll have another round. So maybe, go ahead, yeah.
Good morning or good afternoon. First of all, Michel Jarreau, Secretary General Emeritus of the World Meteorological Organization. First of all, Pascal and Kim, congratulations to what you have done, because I think it's really good that people like you look at the issues in a sort of cross-cutting way. So that's really good. And some of the issues like mitigation, adaptation, have been looked at in other forums. But the real new input in what you have done was the last letter E also, because that's something which has not been really looked at in other forums in connection with the others. But before I ask my question, just a little comment. And Pascal will not be surprised by my question, because we've been discussing that. I think when we talk about climate change, we should not focus just on the temperature issue. The 1.5 is an interesting indicator, but actually what prevents me from sleeping is the impact on extreme events, is the impact on the water cycle, on the hydrological cycle. So 1.5, indeed, it's important, the temperature, but I think we should really focus on the other issue. Now, the problem, and since I know there are many other questions, I'm trying to be short, and although it's the last one in your priorities, I will focus on the letter E, on the SRM. The SRM is something where you mentioned rightly that there is not enough science at this stage to be evaluated, and I fully agree with you. And to encourage research, I also support that. However, what we have to keep in mind is that whatever is done with the suggested SRM will not be uniform. That we know that at least science can tell you it's not going to be uniform impact on the planet. And it's not only, it's addressing mostly the temperature issue, but those of you who you remember the 1970s, you remember the acid rain issue, and with the most promising technique on SRM, you are going to create acid rain on a massive scale, much more massive than what we were worried in the 70s. And then it will do what Pascal was mentioning, to say, oh, it may give the false impression that we can still emit a lot because we are protected from temperature perspective by that. And if we see that the side effects are big, we have to stop, and then huge overshoot, a huge overshoot at that time. So it is really important to invest more in science. In the meantime, I support your approach to encourage a moratorium in whichever way it's done. So that's really good to say, look, don't do anything. Because what will happen is that some countries could actually do it. And the impact of that could be positive for some aspect of the climate change, negative for some other aspect, and it could be positive for some countries and negative for some other countries. For example, what we do know already now is that it will have an impact on the hydrological cycle. That we know. It may have an impact on the monsoon. So imagine that a country like in US, Canada, Russia does something, and then India sees a serious modification of monsoon. That would add to the tension in the world, and we don't really need more tension at this stage. So the key thing is that whatever is done will not be uniform. It will be global. You need governance. And it can be only through a multilateral governance. It cannot be a few countries deciding on their own. Now, the question is, do you believe that we have the time to develop a multilateral governance in the current world in a small number of years? Thank you.
I see, yes, there are 4 questions, so maybe you can, pass the microphone on.
Hello, I'm Bruno Lalinier. I'm a professor at Linköping University, but currently a visiting fellow at the Center for International Environmental Studies here, which is great. So you talk about in your report about higher quality carbon dioxide removal. I found that intriguing, but I didn't really understand what the higher quality was in that. And have you considered moratorium in parts of the carbon dioxide removal as well? Because we have technologies like iron fertilization, for instance, that do have impacts on the global commons as well. So it's not only the SRM that could have such effects.
Yes, I think we can just pass the microphone along.
Okay.
Way, yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for your presentation. Among the different, I'm Jean-Pierre Ramos, Director of 2052, the Governmental Climate Organization. Among the different options you propose, why you don't support a universal carbon pricing on all products and all services? In my view, it has 3 advantages. The first one, it will be fair, because the ones that emit most will have to pay more. Second, it will be educational, because every single person on this planet will suddenly discover there is a carbon budget. And third, it will provide all the revenues that are needed. And as you mentioned yourself, you don't see any place where you can get them. So why not having this option as the first one?
Thank you. Janos Pastor, formerly many things, now retired, happily. And I have a 2-part question. One is that it's been now almost half a year, 5 months since you published the report. Many important things have happened, COP28 amongst others. And the question is, looking back, are there things that you wish you had included in the report or had done differently given these developments? And the related question is that since that time, I agree with Michel, by the way, that the care idea of bringing these things together is absolutely the new thing that is really important. And the question is, did you get any concrete response from governments on how to actually make governance happen for that combination? And related to that, do you have a list of countries who are signing up for the moratorium? Thank you.
Thank you. Arthur Dahl, International Environment Forum, formerly of UNEP. One, there was a recent study that showed that in Europe, the photosynthesis increased on the weekends and decreased during the week because of changes in particulate pollution in the atmosphere, which shows that photosynthesis is extremely sensitive to any attempt to reduce solar radiation. So while you might solve the climate problem but with solar radiation, you may also create an enormous disaster for photosynthesis in nature and in agriculture. Did you look at that question, which shows that there's a very fundamental reason for not interfering with the atmospheric filtering of sunlight? Second question, have you looked at the recent report of the Climate Governance Commission, which was released on the 28th of November at COP28. I helped to organize the commission, so I wanted to hear, have you looked at that, some of the solutions they've now proposed that may follow up from your own work? This is the commission headed by Mary Robinson and Johan Rockstrom and Maria Fernandez Espinosa. So it's a very high-level commission that is trying to go sort of beyond what you've been doing. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, on Michel Jarreau's question, you're absolutely right. And by the way, there are many versions of overshooting the 1.5. There's one version where you overshoot and you keep overshooting. Well, then the problem is not the 1.5. Then there's a version where you overshoot and then, whoop, you succeed in decreasing. And then the operationality of the 1.5 is more serious. Now, on your point about SRM, you're right. It's part of the risks which we have considered. But there is also one risk which we need considering, which is that a country decides to do it without any international discipline. And that's a very high risk in a way. And by the way, it's a risk which fiction writers have already. Well, there was a book in German, which was published last spring, which has not yet been translated in English, by a famous Austrian tech novel writers who start with one country doing this, and then it works. And then, for whatever reason, it stops working because it had been sabotaged, and then another group of countries takes over, and this is a total multilateral mess. So you're right. All these risks have to be considered, and this is what is the origin of the moratorium. Maybe you can take the carbon removal question, and I'll take the universal carbon price, which is a quick answer.
Well, CDR is sort of complicated because what it should refer to is actually taking existing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We do not yet have technologies that do that. There's a lot of interesting research being done to try and find ways of doing it. But we have not, I mean, the most successful device we have for doing that at the moment is probably a tree, but we are trying to find ways of doing it. But sometimes carbon capture and sequestration is called CDR. But to me, what carbon capture and sequestration is really is creating carbon and then taking it out. It isn't really dealing with the net reduction. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't, get into this, greenwashing, scenario that companies, in particular oil companies, are doing, where they're suggesting that by virtue of being able perhaps to capture some carbon in a flue and put it under the ground, that they are making a great contribution. That is not CDR in the sense of dealing with the 1.5, I think. So we did not talk about a moratorium on that, but I think we do make the distinction between what that is and what carbon dioxide removal is, and it's a difficult issue. Whether it's growing kelp and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. I mean, there are ways of actually reducing the net existing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but a lot of things that people are calling CDR are actually really kind of bogus. They're just allowing them to do things that are creating the emissions and then putting them someplace else, and that does not, in the end, deal with this challenge to become carbon neutral by 2015. They're not reducing the number. They're just limiting the increase in emissions.
So, universal carbon price, of course, silver bullet for global market capitalism. From the moment you agree on the price. And this is where it does not work. Because there's no way, knowing how international negotiations go, there's no way there will be any time soon a consensus on what economic science says should be roughly the zone of carbon pricing, which is, let's say, somewhere between 150, a bit more, a bit less. Zero chance. Zero chance. I know this is the thesis of my good friend Ngozi, which I will be discussing with in a few, in an hour. And I understand why. It's a perfect solution. But it will not happen. And we cannot bank on anything like there is a small probability that it will happen. On Janos Pastor questions, first, what would we look at, which we haven't done properly? I already, I think, answered this question, finance resources. This is the big bit where we are nowhere near any proper scale of allowed resources. And again, if I had to restart, I'm not saying I would start with there, but I would do another one on how to properly value nature, its services, in order to internalize the way global market capitalism works. I'm too old now to believe that we have to do a revolution before that. It's a sort of idea which changes with your age. On the question whether there is any chance for a comprehensive, structured agenda to permeate climate conversations, the odds are little, not least because of what Kim said about the weaknesses of the Paris Agreement, which was a great thing, was agreeing to go to zero, but to the price of we all do it our way. And this is, in a way, a sort of inbuilt negation of global governance. Global governance works with multilaterally determined obligations and commitments. No. If everybody goes à la carte, it won't work. Now, this being said, when I look at the experience of COPs, for instance, I can see a way to a more holistic approach, which is not top-down but bottom-up. If I look at, we were discussing with WHO this morning, if you look at health, you have to look at the whole range if you address it through the health impact of climate change. I'm working a lot on the ocean now. If you look at the ocean, then you have to look at the whole range of all these options. So in a way, it's not just a possible sort of structured international agenda. It may come in engaging stakeholders, local communities. They will have to look at all these options simultaneously, because the notion that there are trade-offs between these options is maybe clearer if you are at a smaller level of geographical coverage than a bigger one. And again, the issue has very much to do with trade-offs between risks and resources. And I think this has to come. I'm not sure that the next COP will have a climate overshoot commission structured agenda, but I think you mentioned the insurance industry. I'm working with them to prepare the next UN conference in Nice in 2025. When I discuss with insurance company, they have a much wider range of consideration than many of the COP negotiators. Okay.
I think the last question about whether we'd seen other, well, first of all, the effects of solar change. Yes, I'm very aware of that. But there's always nothing. Michael Woodcock said there's no such thing as an unmixed blessing. And yes, you have your ups and downs. But yes, more reports have come out, and good people are working on these issues. And the challenge is to try and, as they connect dots and make sure that the wisdom that is coming out of these deliberations is influencing the conversations. But I'm Mary. I worked with Mary for years, and her focus on climate justice and all the things that she's been doing. But I think that again, going back to this question of finance and the cost of nature, et cetera, when we look at things like so many subsidies to fossil fuel industries. I mean, so many of these transactions are based on very bad economic analysis, because there are whole areas of impact that are not included in the calculus. And I think when you're talking about a carbon tax, what you're really talking about is the educational value of forcing people to recognize that goods and services and activities carry with them this impact, this footprint, this change. And I think that maybe a global carbon tax may not be possible, but individual countries have managed to implement them in individual jurisdictions. And they do have an educated value, because they force people to recognize that certain things aren't free, that they're not free, that we're doing these things and that there is a cost for them. And what we have to try and do is to create the calculus among governments and their financial instruments that does not ignore that cost. And I think, as Pascal was talking about the evaluation, for so long, that is a piece of the puzzle we haven't been taking into account. And as a result, there's been a lot of free riding so that people come to expect that that's the normal way of things, not recognizing that it's been a huge, huge gift at the expense of the future of the planet.
Thank you so much for your responses. This conversation is not over. However, we have run out of time for this session. So I would like to thank you very much, Kim Campbell and Pascal Lamy, for joining us here today and for sharing your insights. And if you have not already done so, do read the report and keep engaging with these important questions. Thank you very much. Also, for those of you who are online, we didn't see you, but we know you're there.
Our report is online, and we also have a very nifty website. I'm quite impressed with how high-tech our website is. So do log on. Thank you. Thank you for your interest.
Sure.